And now for the main program. We were supposed to have two distinguished speakers today, but unfortunately, Otto Brøns Petersen, who many of you may know as a prominent Danish libertarian, was forced to cancel his participation because he is working at the Ministry of Taxation, where he's currently drafting the government's competitiveness package, and he's so busy that he couldn't make it here. He was very sorry he couldn't come. But fortunately, we still have our main speaker for today, Jared Casey, who is a professor of political philosophy at the University College Dublin, Ireland, and who is also the author of several well-known books. The latest publication, I think, is Libertarian Anarchy Against the State, which he will be giving a talk about tomorrow at the Libertas conference, as I understand. But today we've invited Professor Casey to talk about Murray Rothbard, another prominent thinker who Casey is also quite an expert on, as Professor Casey has written a book called Murray Rothbard, which is part of a book series on the major libertarian and conservative thinkers. Here at CEPOS, we have previously had seminars about several other libertarian thinkers, but we've never had the pleasure before of devoting an entire evening to Murray Rothbard and his ideas. So I am very pleased to give the floor to Professor Casey for his address on Murray Rothbard.
I'm very pleased to be here this evening. It's my first time in Denmark, my first time in Copenhagen, which I'm told means a merchant's harbour. Don't know how I managed to avoid coming here before, but anyway, better late than never. This is something of a return visit, because I was just saying to my host a few moments ago, half my wife's family is almost entirely Viking. Her mother's family is MacAuliffe, which of course is simply Olaf with an Irish prefix in front of it. And her father's name is Brophy, which is Bruder, who was the name of the person who killed the Irish King Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. So this is something of a return visit. I'm wonderfully amused, as you were all when you started laughing, that the respondent, who unfortunately couldn't be here this evening, cannot be here because he is involved with the affairs of the Ministry of Taxation, which is a wonderful thing for a libertarian to be involved in. Could I just say, this is a shameless book advertisement. The series Major Conservative and Libertarian Thinkers comes out in 20 volumes. Since it's published at some ridiculous price, the only person who have read this is me, the editor, and a cat. Okay, and so I wrote to my publisher some months ago and said, please, 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 could we give this to some independent publisher to do it so that somebody else besides the three of us might read it? And he said, oh, forgot to tell you, we're bringing it out in paperback. And I said, well, thank you for telling me. So the first 10 volumes of this series have come out in January. And the remaining 10 volumes, including my one, will be out in July. So if anybody wants to get a copy of the book on Rothbard, it's available. You won't have to mortgage your house to buy in a paperback. Okay. So maybe I can just say a few words how I got involved in this. Many people discover libertarianism when they're young and then forget about it when they're a little bit older, especially when they work for the government. The phenomenon that Murray Rothbard calls the Beltway libertarian, but I'll say a bit more about that later on. I am a very late convert to this. I was blissfully ignorant of all of this material, and happily so, until my colleague, with whom I had discussions on many matters, one of them was on money, why I didn't have enough of it. No, that was a joke. The nature of money. And so he went to Germany on a year's leave of absence, and when he came back, he brought me back a book, I think to stop me talking. And it was Ludwig von Mises' Theory of Money and Credit. Now, if you're going to give anybody a starting book to read in this area, this is not the book. Okay, this is a German book. Okay, this is a serious book. It's long. And it's got lots of footnotes. My former professors used to say to me, in a French book, never read the footnotes that are for decoration. In the German book, you should read only the footnotes. But anyway, this is a serious book. But for me, because I had a question about the nature of money, discovering this book, I read it like a novel. I'm a page turner, couldn't really get it fast enough, and it was as if a light went off. Now, that was only 8 years ago. And then I read everything I could read by Mises, Bureaucracy, Socialism, Human Action. And then, of course, before long, anybody in this area, once you start looking around, you fall into the pit known as the Mises Institute. And once you're there, there's no getting out again. Okay? And then, of course, I discovered Rothbard, and who was, and this is, of course, is the transition to what I'm going to talk about today, was a student of Mises in the United States. Somebody once said to me, there are no Austrians left in Austria, which is an interesting thing to say. Okay, what are all those people doing who are living there, right? But it may well be true, if you like, in economics. So let me then just read you a few pieces which I've excerpted from the book. And what I'd like to do is to talk for not very long, because having turned up here on the Friday afternoon after work, the last thing you need to do is be punished. Okay, so I will speak for maybe 30, 35 minutes. And then, because I'm not actually certain of what it is that you are interested in talking about, I would like to leave as much time as possible for you to ask me questions. So my stopping talking doesn't mean that I don't want to talk some more. Anyone who knows me knows that I have to be forcibly restrained from talking. But to give you the opportunity to ask particular questions, and then I can direct it that way, so that we have a better chance that I will address something that actually concerns you rather than just me. So, one of Rothbard's colleagues, when he wrote his obituary, Rothbard died in the mid-90s. He said, "It wasn't like Murray Rothbard to die. Nothing he ever did was more out of character, more difficult to reconcile with everything we knew of him, more downright inconceivable. Murray dead is a contradiction in terms." Now, you probably, unless you've actually heard, I didn't know him personally, but I've heard him speaking. And he was from the Lower East Side of New York, Jewish quarter. There's a certain type there, and which is generally intellectually brilliant, terrifyingly bright, razor sharp, and he had a laugh that was like a machine gun. He cackled, he'd go, ah! And he began. I remember once he gave a lecture. I had it on record. You can find it on the Mises Institute, where he says, I'm not going to try to do the New York accent. He said, couldn't do it. He said, some people accuse me, he said, of using the ad hominem. Now, the ad hominem argument is where you attack the man. He said, I never do that. He said, first of all, I attack the argument, and then I attack the man. And then he cackled. Okay. Now, there are thinkers such as St. Augustine and Kierkegaard whose character comes through in everything they write, whose intellectual hearts are, so to speak, displayed prominently on their sleeves. Other thinkers, such as, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, reveal almost nothing about themselves in their writings. If you read Aquinas, you'll never know that he lived through one of the most exciting times in Western history, that he was a strike breaker, that the Pope had to intervene with the University of Paris to give him his degree. Nothing. Nothing appears on the page. Just calm, detached rationality. You read St. Augustine, you know what he had for breakfast. Everything, it's there, it's honestly. Okay. Murray Rothbard, economist, historian, political and moral philosopher, legal theoretician, political activist, polemicist, very much a polemicist, and above all, libertarian, can be firmly located in the Augustinian Kierkegaardian camp. To read him is to know him, not just whatever he happens to be writing about. Everything he wrote is invested with his personality and his character. The one thing you cannot be towards Rothbard is indifferent. You will either love him or you will loathe him, okay? And people have done both, sometimes at the same time, okay? But you will not be indifferent, I guarantee you. He was born in 1926. His father, David Rothbard, was a Polish immigrant who had arrived in the USA in 1910. The environment in which the young Rothbard was reared in Manhattan and Broadway leaned decidedly towards the left of the political spectrum. He himself said that the members of the Jewish community in which he lived were largely either communist or communist fellow travelers. By the time he left school, however, Rothbard was a convinced conservative, opposed to socialism, communism, and the Roosevelt New Deal, which of course was not only communist but actually fascist. But enough about that another time. His sympathies at this period of his life, his mid-teens, lay with what the American New Right, a movement which had begun in opposition to the New Deal, and later came to be characterized by its anti-statist and anti-interventionist approach to politics. It was really damaged by the war because non-interventionism was not popular during the war, and that basically, apart from the fact that many of them just died at the time, it sort of killed it off as a popular movement. Around this time, Rothbard came into contact with the Foundation for Economic Education, which was his first encounter with organized libertarianism. From this time on, he immersed himself in whatever literature was available of a libertarian stripe. We find him reading Garrett, Isabel Patterson, Albert J., Nock, Herbert Spencer, Henry George, Mencken, and Ludwig Mises. He was highly impressed by Mises' Human Action, which came out in English in 1949, and he became a regular member and participant in the Mises seminar in 1949. Mises had moved, obviously, from Austria to Switzerland during the war for reasons not too hard to figure out, and then from Switzerland to the United States, and ended up at New York University in a sort of adjunct capacity, where he started a seminar. All German professors have to have seminars. Okay, if I were a German professor, I'd have one too, but I'm not. This seminar continued in operation for most of his time at Mises' time at NYU. And once introduced to Austrian economics, something, by the way, he learned nothing at all about during his economic education at Columbia, one of the best universities in the United States, he had heard nothing about, he quickly became expert in the subject. Now, Power and Market, Government and the Economy was published in 1970. Originally intended to be part of his treatise on economics, Man, Economy, and the State. Has anybody here read Man, Economy, and the State? Well, the first, you have. Fantastic. We must talk afterwards. I must learn how you actually managed to carry this book around. Okay? It's 1,600 pages long. I had some students come to me a few years ago, and they said, we'd like you, this is purely private, we'd like to read some of this material with you. And I said, very good. What would you like to read? And they said, Man, Economy, and the State. And I said, are you sure? And they said, yes. And I went to my shelf and I staggered back with this book. And they said, you really want to read this? They said, yes. I said, okay, all right. You've been warned. This was originally intended, Power and Market was originally intended to be part of Man, Economy, and State, but the publishers had demurred at its inclusion, primarily because of its anarchist implications. I'll say a bit more about that maybe later and certainly tomorrow. Power and Market is a comprehensive expression of Rothbard's political philosophy and contains themes that would be practically and thematically developed in two books, one For a New Liberty and the other, The Ethics of Liberty. For a New Liberty resulted from an invitation from the publishers Macmillan after Rothbard was the subject of much publicity following the publication of two articles in the New York Times in 1971. And the Koch Industries gave Rothbard a research grant to enable him to write The Ethics of Liberty. Of that book, Rothbard later said, quote, it was supposed to be a reconciliation of libertarianism with conservative culture and personal ethics, what is called paleo-libertarianism today. But as I worked on it, it turned into an anarcho-libertarian treatise. By the early 60s, conservatives had become pro-war, and the whole idea of reconciling us with them had lost its attraction for me. Okay, so For a New Liberty then was subtitled The Libertarian Manifesto, contains not only a 90-page treatment of the principles of libertarianism, but a 250-page treatment of specific applications of libertarian theory to areas such as involuntary servitude, education, welfare, inflation, the public sector, conservation, war, and foreign policy, and many others beside. And if that isn't enough, he also provides a how to get there from here. Okay, and I have a suspicion that many of you would like to talk about this a little bit later on, so I'll kind of leave that till later. So we can talk about what Rothbard had to say in those books from the 70s and 80s and what we might want to say about that in the year 2013. Okay, the Ethics of Liberty was published about 9 years later in 1982, and while the structure of this book is very similar to the first, the philosophical treatment of the principles of libertarianism, while shorter, is also deeper. The section containing the application of the theory is at once more philosophically sophisticated and at the same time deals with a different range of problems, this time voluntary exchange, ownership and aggression, property, criminality, land theft, land monopoly, self-defense, punishment, children, bribery, the boycott, contracts, lifeboat situations, and animal rights. I use this book in my upper level undergraduate course called, because I don't want the students to know what they're doing, called Anarchy, Law, and the State. When we get to the stuff on children, people start to faint. One young woman came to me and said, when we read this chapter, I could feel my uterus move. Okay, and I thought, well, I can understand why. It's a bit much to take, right? So, but it's boring. It is not. So Rothbard wrote, he said, the libertarian creed rests upon one central axiom, that no man or group of men may aggress against the person or property of anyone else. Aggression being defined as the initiation of the use or threat of physical violence against the person or property of anyone else. It's important, by the way, to note that this is not a pacifist charter. While what is ruled out by the non-aggression principle is the initiation of violence or the threat of violence against another person or property, it does not rule out the use of violence in the defense of one's person or property, or in the defense of another person or property, okay, provided you're willing to take the risk of getting things wrong. Okay. One may, of course, decline to defend one's person or property by force, either for reasons of principle or for reasons of prudence. But if so, that is a choice that one may make if one so chooses. It's not a necessary consequence of the non-aggression principle. Now, while particular individuals have aggressed and still do aggress against other persons and property, Rothbard believes that throughout history, and I quote, there has been one central, dominant, and overriding aggressor upon all of these rights, the state. If I may quote, I don't know if this is proper to do, if I may quote from my own book, this is a really good book. My wife tells me, don't say things like that, people will take you seriously. Okay. The first sentence in my book says, states are criminal organizations, full stop. Right? Just in case anybody is in any doubt as to what this book means. Okay. And I go on to say, all states, not just the obviously totalitarian or oppressive ones. And then I make an exception, because I'm a Catholic. The only possible exceptions to this sweeping claim are those mini-states that are in effect swollen bits of private property, such as the Vatican. Okay. So much for principle. Anyway, so it's the state. The state is the particular object of his scorn and hatred and vilification and so on. What is special and significant about Rothbard's treatment of the state and its agents is that he insists that the consistent libertarian should hold them accountable to the same moral norms as every other individual. This is a very important point. He says, the libertarian refuses to give the state the moral sanction to commit actions that almost everyone agrees would be immoral, illegal, and criminal if committed by any person or group in society. It's really important. Because the state, for all this history, and we can talk more about this later, has always used reasons of state to do things that look like robbery or aggression, and so on. And they said, well, we have to do it, and so on. We're very, very sorry to take all your money or to kidnap you and put you in the armed services or whatever it might be doing, but we need to do this. And you go, right, if anybody else did it, they'd be arrested. Murder is murder, whether committed by an individual or by the state through its agents. Theft is theft, whether committed by an individual or by the state through its agents. The transparently obscurantist device of calling these ethical violations by other names succeeds only so long as people are willing to believe that taxation is not really theft. Okay. And wars of aggression do not really involve murder. It's testimony to the power of long usage in propaganda that so many people do so believe. Rothbard claims that the state employs a whole class of propagandists, of court intellectuals, whose job it is to persuade the public that only the state can provide for the common good and the public welfare, and that a whole range of services would not be provided if the state were not there to supply them. Who are these court intellectuals? Well, the media, okay, by and large. Okay? Anybody who takes the government's money, by and large, in almost any respect, is dependent upon it, are very happy to do this, and so on. We have in Ireland a triangulation between our state-run television station, the two major papers, the Irish Independent, which is not independent, the Irish Times, paper of record, which is not the paper of record, okay, and then our Parliament and so on, and they keep echoing. It's collusive, okay. Anyway, When one examines the rhetoric of defenders of the state, one point that comes across with monotonous regularity is the allegedly unique nature of the state, which allows it to operate in ways not available to ordinary people. Reasons of state is supposed to be a full and complete justification for actions that would ordinarily be condemned as criminal or immoral or both. For centuries, writes Rothbard, the state has committed mass murder and called it war. For centuries, the state has enslaved people into its armed battalions and called it conscription in the national service. For centuries, the state has robbed people at bayonet point and called it taxation. Somebody emailed me a week or so ago and said, how can you possibly be a libertarian if you're a Christian? And I said, I don't see the problem. Here's the reason. If I don't go to church on a Sunday morning, nobody comes and pulls me out of bed. If I don't put money in the collection plate, nobody takes my wallet out of my pocket and forcibly extracts the money. What was your question again? Okay, what's the problem? Okay. But if I don't pay my taxes, then bad things happen. Okay. In the end, there is no such thing as a state, if by that we mean an entity ontologically distinct and superior to ordinary people. The state is simply a name for a particular group of people acting at a particular time in particular ways under a particular description. The moral law applies to all human actors, whether they act as agents or principals, or whether they benefit personally from their depredations or not. The state on one level then is simply just an organization, but the state differs from all other organizations, all other criminal organizations such as the mafia, inasmuch as it receives its income by coercion and violence or the threat of coercion or violence. The state employs coercion and violence not only to generate its income, but also to take upon itself to interfere, and this is where it gets really serious, often radically in the lives of its citizens. Right. The state's always been a bad idea, from the beginning, from the empires, from Babylon and Egypt and Mesopotamia, through Rome, and so on. The state in the Middle Ages was a bad idea, such as it existed. But the state as we know it now is a modern invention. The state as we know it now came into existence in 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia, as we know it. And the state as we know it now gets its particular virulence from the French Revolution, okay, which is really the first effort to make a completely totalitarian state. And ever since then, through the 18th century and the 19th century and into the 20th century and now the 21st, we have the state interfering in every aspect of your life. The Romans never did this, right? As long as you paid your taxes, they left you alone by and large, right? They didn't tell you what food you should eat and whether you should wear belts and how hot the water in your house should be and so on and so forth. Well, the modern state, if you like, interferes increasingly in almost every aspect of your life. You might get the impression I don't like the state, okay? And you would be right. Some attempt to justify the state by claiming that the state is us. We are the state. Or somewhat less radically, that the state represents us. And so what appears to be an interference with liberty is just that, simply an appearance. Again, that's something I'm very happy to discuss during question time, is how I have a chapter in my book, Libertarian Anarchy, where I think I demonstrate to my own satisfaction, if nobody else's, okay, that the notion of representation is a complete myth. In fact, the state does not represent us, in fact, cannot represent us. On a purely personal level, I went, during a recent general election, I went to my polling booth, and I spent 10 minutes in the polling booth, and everybody was wondering what I was doing, clearly. So I had a piece of paper, and I wrote, "Dear candidates, you do not represent me. You cannot represent me. Please go away and leave me alone. Get an honest job, full stop." Yeah, that was fun. I think my vote might have been invalid, but anyway. So the state is us, but it's not, and we can talk about that a little bit later. In order for the state to function, however, the mass of people has to believe in its necessity and legitimacy. No institution can work if the mass of people really that it deals with doesn't really believe that it's right in doing what it does. And indeed, most people, even if they're not enthusiastic supporters of the state, acquiesce in what it does. And as I said, to that end, the state employs a class of professional apologists and controls the means of propaganda, often through domination of the education system. Again, I was saying to my host coming in the car from the airport that Emanuel Lasker, the chess world champion in the early 20th century, once said, "I spent most of my life unlearning things." Right? And I have to say the same thing. I mean, the history I was taught when I was in school was absolutely ridiculous, but it took me an awful long time to get it out of my head, right? And if you want to control people, control the education system. The task of the state apologist is to explain the following: that murder isn't murder when perpetrated by the state, that theft isn't theft, that kidnapping isn't kidnapping. It's to convince the public that what the state does is not crime on a gigantic scale, but something necessary and vital that must be supported and obeyed. In return for their services, the apologists are rewarded with power and status and allowed to share in the booty obtained from the masses. Goodies for all. Now, Rothbard's definition of the state is twofold. He says the state is that organization that, one, acquires its revenue by physical coercion, and two, achieves compulsory monopoly of force and ultimate decision-making power over a given territorial area. This territorial stuff really doesn't come in until Westphalia. Okay. Before then, it's much porous. In both these aspects, the state interferes with the property and liberty of the individual. Through taxation, the state aggresses against the property of the individual, and through the variety of compulsory monopolies it enjoys, the state aggresses against the free exchange of goods and services in the area of which it claims control. Let's turn away from the state, because there's a whole lot of wonderfully interesting stuff in Rothbard. And by the way, don't let anything I say put you off from reading Rothbard. Make sure you read Rothbard. He deals with a lot of personal liberty. So let me just take a random, more or less random selection and talk about some of these, because some of these have really radical implications if you follow them through. Let's begin with free speech. Are we, or should we be, free to say whatever we like about whomever or whatever we like? That's the question Rothbard asks. And his answer is yes. Okay, not maybe, or in some circumstances, or as long as you don't hurt their feelings. No, 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 no. It's yes. Okay? You can be an idiot. You can be offensive if you choose to. There are ways of controlling those things. But should you be free, that is to say, should there be no legal objection to your doing all of these things? The answer is yes. There should not be a legal prohibition on doing this. This has a number of controversial implications. In most jurisdictions, one finds on the statute books crimes of incitement, conspiracy, and attempt. Whatever about attempt, incitement, and conspiracy are problematic from a libertarian perspective. If I advise or counsel or exhort someone to commit a crime, as things stand, I render myself open to criminal prosecution. The morality of such advice, counsel or exhortation, is not in question. Some may think it good, some may think it bad. What is to be considered is whether such acts should be illegal from a libertarian perspective. Now, in general, the law requires there to be a causal link between allegedly criminal acts and the consequences. But as Rothbard points out, unless a man's freedom of the will has been abrogated, I cannot simply by means of my advice, counsel, or exhortation compel someone to commit a criminal act. I can say, oh, I think it would be a good idea to shoot the Prime Minister. And the person goes off and shoots the Prime Minister. And Rothbard says, what should be my legal responsibilities? Answers, none. I didn't shoot the Prime Minister. Okay, I don't control the will of the person. I'm not some kind of hypnotist, or I didn't plant something in their brain. That person shot the Prime Minister. So no limitations on free speech in that area. Having heard what I had to say, the decision to act or not to act remains the prerogative of the actor. Similar considerations apply to the putative crime of conspiracy. Needless to say, if the advisor or the conspirator ceases merely to talk and begins to act in a criminal fashion, then matters are entirely different. And of course, there are always borderline issues, and we can talk about that again if we want to during our break. About very often you get arguments, it's not possible to draw a sharp line between this, and therefore we cannot make a distinction, to which I say nonsense. We can make the distinctions. Borderline situations are not ultimately problematic. I gave that one away, right? Okay. So, the laws on libel and slander, defamation, I don't know what they're like here in Denmark. They vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In the common law jurisdictions, by the way, you are not allowed to say or to write or put in any form of recording any information which would have the effect of lowering the person you're talking about in the eyes of right-thinking people. Truth is not a defense. Okay? Even if you're a scoundrel, okay? And I say so. And I lower you, paradox, well, I suppose most people don't know about it, and I manage to lower your reputation in the eyes of right-thinking people. I open myself to an action for defamation, either libel or slander, depending on whether it's permanent or impermanent. Now, one must distinguish between what is morally appropriate and what should be considered legal. Again, traditional moral theology identifies the sins of calumny and slander. Calumny was the unwarranted revelation of true facts about somebody that had the result of damaging his reputation, whereas slander was the spreading of untruths about somebody that had the effect of damaging the reputation, and both, of course, are morally problematic. Many people would agree on the general reprehensibility of such conduct, but however matters may be morally, should such conduct be legally prohibited? If so, on what basis? And the legal basis of the laws on libel and slander appear to rest on the assumption that a man has a property right in his reputation. But think about it. What is your reputation? Your reputation is what other people think about you. I have no right over what anybody thinks about me. I may wish to think them all to think that I'm wonderful and marvelous. Who doesn't? Okay? But I have no right to insist upon that. It's nothing to do with me. It's not a property right. So if it's damaged, nothing, I mean, however damaging it might be in some larger sense, it's not something that Rothbard thinks that you should be able to sue on, to take an action. It's not aggression, because aggression is the initiation of violence or the threat to initiate violence against your person or your property. Your reputation is not your property, consequently. Okay. What about things like boycotting? In other words, where you organize with people to take away the custom or the support of a particular institution. And Rothbard would say that's perfectly legal, provided that you do not use aggression or you do not use violence. This actually happened when I was living in the United States. I was living in just outside Washington, and there was a local grocery store where they sold sort of what are euphemistically known as men's magazines. They're up on the top shelf. And the people in the locality organized the boycott. They simply said, we will not patronize your establishment, okay, and we will advise other people not to patronize your establishment unless you remove these. Now, from a libertarian perspective, is that justifiable? And Rothbard would say, absolutely. As long as you're not throwing bricks through the guy's window or setting fire or threatening the people who come, yep, absolutely. Boycott, yes. And boycott, by the way, comes from Captain Boycott in Ireland, who was a British land agent and so on, and collecting rents for his landlord against the tenants, and they boycotted, hence the name, what he did and so on. So one thing we've given to world culture is boycotting. What of picketing and demonstrations? Well, again, assuming that the picketers and demonstrators have a right to occupy the place on which the picketing or demonstrating is taking place, then unless the picketing or demonstration necessarily involves some other legal acts, it's legitimate. Operating through this whole realm, you might say, are we getting towards something like a principle here? Is there some kind of principle that seems to guide you in all of these things so that you don't have to, as it were, think from the scratch about how you would deal with them? And the answer is yes. To put the matter a little crudely, you might express the fundamental rule here as my house, my rules. All right, think about it. If you own your own house, let's assume you're single and married. If you're married, you don't own your house. Okay. Okay. Try wallpapering without telling your wife about it, and you discover who owns the house. Okay, that's not, sorry. Too much, revealing too much here. If somebody comes into your house and they start speaking in a way that you find offensive, normally what you would normally say to them, I prefer you didn't talk about this or use these words or and so on and so forth. And if they said, I have a right to free speech, I can say anything you like, your answer would be, well, fine, but you do it somewhere else. Not in my house. It's my house. I'm the only one who decides what goes on in my house. I'm the only arbiter of the conduct in my house. Again, this meeting here is organized by CIPOS. Okay, it's your meeting. You are the only ones who can determine what is said and by whom and in what circumstances. If you decide that somebody is behaving objectionably, you have every right, according to the Rothbard, to throw them out in their ear. Okay. It's my house, my rules. It's determined by property. That brings us to a very famous example discussed in American jurisprudence about whether one had the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. And Rob Roberts said, well, there's nothing specifically problematic about this. When you go into a theater, you don't have the right to shout fire. You don't have the right to shout Geronimo if it comes to that, or to shout anything. Why? Because you're there under license. When you go into a cinema, you have engaged in a contract with the owner of that property, and you have purchased a license which allows you to go into the theater, to sit down quietly, enjoy the performance, and at the end of the performance, leave. You also don't have a right to set up a hot dog stand, okay? To chat to your friends, so tell that to some of the people who go to these performances, right? Or incessantly look at your mobile phone, right? There's nothing special about it. The property, you're there under a license, and the license limits what it is that you can do. If you don't want to be there under license, then don't go in. If you want to have your own cinema where you can shout fire to your heart's content, well, hey, get your own cinema. What's the problem? There's nothing special about any of these things. All right? So again, maybe, again, I would like, if somebody would ask me questions in the area I'm just going to go into now, because my next book, if I ever get around to writing it, okay, if I can ever get away from my students, is going to be called Freedom and Authority. And I'm going to be distinguishing between power, okay, which I think is completely unjustifiable, and authority, which is not. Okay, and that's because even though I'm a libertarian, I'm a cultural conservative. Now, let's take the example of something like pornography. Pornography is a particularly troubling issue for those libertarians with conservative leanings. That's not the only one, but let's just take it as an example. Once again, we must invoke the distinction between the immoral and the illegal. And you'll begin to see not only the my house, my rules is the principle that guides what you're doing here, but the sharp distinction between the immoral on the one hand and the illegal on the other hand as a sort of radical tool of libertarianism. The issue is not really whether pornography is immoral or degrading or rather liberal expression of spontaneous sexuality or whatever. All of these things, while relevant to the issue of the morality of pornography, none of them is relevant to the question of whether or not pornography should be legally prohibited. The only question for the libertarian is whether the law should be used to enforce a particular morality where the issue in question does not pertain to the matter of defending people against aggression directed at their persons or property. And the libertarian answer is clear. You should be beginning to get it by now. The law has no business enforcing purely moral considerations. These things can, in fact, be addressed if you have a strong, if you like, if a strong notion of what property and what property rights are. These can be organized in that particular way. So you could organize with all of the property owners in a particular area and exclude pornography from your particular area of town. No problem. Unproblematic. And somebody else could do the opposite in their section if they chose to do so, if the property owners agreed. Right? But not by means of a law which applies generally or across the board. Anyway, let's now look then, those are some issues of personal sort of liberties, and let's look at the public sector, this is called. The experience of many libertarians has been that the objection most often raised against a completely free market approach to provision of all goods and services is that there are simply some goods and services that do not lend themselves to such an approach, so-called public goods. So there's a YouTube video called "It's the Roads, Man." Okay, it's like, okay, we wouldn't have roads, okay, if we didn't have it. I suggest you look that one up. It's really funny. You need an American accent to do it properly. Anyway, so we're told that only a state can provide a road system, a rail system. Only a state can organize the airwaves so that chaos is avoided. Only a state can arrange for the safe delivery of water and the removal and disposal of waste. Only a state can provide policing and the administration of justice, and so on. None of this is true. Let me give you an example. Okay, now the strongest one and the hardest one to defend, clearly, is the administration of justice, policing, and defense. And that's what I address in my book, okay? Because I figure if you can knock that one down, then all of the rest will fall automatically. But let's just take an example. Part of the problem here when you're dealing with people is, I'd say, it's just the lack of imagination. People simply cannot imagine that the way, sorry, let me start again. They believe that the way things are is not only the way things are, but the way that they must be. We're all prisoners of our imagination. So let me just tell you the story, and you will laugh, right? I hope. Okay? When I was growing up in Ireland in the 50s and 60s, if you wanted a telephone, you had to apply to the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, which was a government agency. And the normal period of waiting before you got one, if you got one, was 2.5 to 3 years. All right? However, if you were a physician, a doctor, and you needed it for your practice, you could get it in record time, 3 months. They would come, if they came, and they would install it wherever they chose in your house, usually in the hallway, which was drafty and cold, right? You had no choice of apparatus. Billing was a mystical art known only to God and God only knows who, right? You got a bill, it wasn't itemized, you didn't know what you were paying for, you didn't dare complain, they would come and take it away. Now, when I say this to my students, all of whom have mobile phones and cannot be restrained from using them during lectures, okay, the idea, see, for us, this was the norm. It was unthinkable that there could be a phone service which wasn't state-organized, state-run, administered in this way. Now, it's all gone. In 17th century Europe, it was unthinkable that you could have a political system which wasn't monarchical, and I don't mean in the sense of having a constitutional monarch, okay, who met ambassadors and shook hands, but actually ruled. Now, it's unthinkable that you would. These things all change. So anyway, now, as a matter of fact, in almost all the areas, except the, I'm going to push aside the stuff on law and security and policing, in almost all of these areas, in fact, all of these public goods were originally provided privately. So I often say to my students, they say, oh, well, we wouldn't have roads. And I say, you know where the original roads came from? Apart from the ones built by the Romans to get their troops back and forward, right? You know where all the roads came from? They came in the 18th century by people who collected money and took shares and collected toll roads. Those were all set up privately. And they say, oh, well, what about the railways? All privately organized and run. What about the canals? All privately organized and run and operated. What about the schools? All set up privately and organized outside the realm of the state. All of these things have been provided historically from outside the remit of the state and can be provided and would be provided, again, as appropriate. One of the good effects, of course, would be to take education out of the hands of the state completely. That would be a very, very good thing, let me say. Anyway, okay, let's see, moving along. Take policing, just to move slightly into this area, and again in question time, I'm going to stop shortly. You can ask me some more questions on this if you like. Take the notion of policing. One must recognize immediately that police protection is not a single indivisible service, uniformly given over a certain area. How many policemen there shall be, what equipment they shall have, where they shall be located, what crimes shall attract their attention and be prioritized, all these are decisions that must be made by whoever is responsible for the provision of this service. As with any other service, food supply, road pricing, the monopolistic state has no rational way of making decisions on these matters. Quote, this is Rothbard again, the government only knows that it has a limited budget, its allocations of funds are then subject to the full play of politics, boondoggling, and bureaucratic inefficiency. On a free market, customers would get as much protection as they're willing to pay for. Right now, where I live, it's very, very low crime, it's almost non-existent. But if ever my house were broken into and my television were taken, I think my life would end. But anyway, if it were taken, I'd call up the police, and what would happen is, probably the next day, okay, they would arrive, and they would ask me for the numbers on the television, and I would give them, and I would say, what are the chances of getting this back? And they would say, recovery rate is less than 3%. And that's it. Most people provide their own security. Okay, if they've got serious things to defend, you wouldn't want to rely on the police to do it for you. Okay. Anyway, which laws, here's the interesting thing, which laws shall our police forces enforce? Again, in state-run police forces, those matters are determined by political considerations. Given the staggering profusion of laws, a policy of zero tolerance is simply not possible, even assuming it were in fact desirable. Many laws currently of the statute books are a benefit to nobody but the state that makes them, and perhaps not even to them. Customers in the real world, on the other hand, would be willing to pay only for the enforcement of those laws that actually protect their lives and property, and would be reluctant to pay for laws, the purpose of which is to interfere in matters of which our legislators disapprove. Look, suppose the people down the road have disgusting habits of one kind or another, right? And you think that they're loathsome. They're not doing it in public, but they're doing it in private. You can think all you like, okay? But if I'm going to pay for the protection of my property. If you say, well, if you want us to interfere with what they're doing in their house, it's going to cost you another. I say, I'm not really that pushed about it one way or the other, right? But you have the state doing it, and suddenly all sorts of actions that are of no concern to nobody, legally, morally yes, legally no, are being interfered with. We have a long history of this. Okay. Finally, the contemporary relevance. The global financial crisis that started in 2008 was widely seen as evidence of the failure of what the popular press likes to call unrestrained capitalism. The image is portrayed as one of greedy financiers and speculators playing irresponsibly with other people's money with no regard for the consequences of their actions on the so-called real economy. The response of many governments to the crisis has been to adopt a neo-Keynesian interventionist approach to the financial sector, which includes such strategies as quantitative easing. I love that term. Quantitative easing. We print more money, right? The injection of massive amounts of new money into the economy, the partial or complete nationalization of banks, or the setting up of quasi-government agencies to siphon off and manage the bank's bad debts. We had this in Ireland. We're still our insane government, even more insane than most, decided, before they finally collapsed, to cover the entire banking debt of our bankrupt debts, landing us with a bill of something like 65 billion euros, which I and the other taxpayers are somehow supposed to pay. I'm going, how did this happen again? Where did I sign up for this? I don't quite remember this. Okay, it's absolutely insane. Of course, what the crisis is evidence for, and I'm moving towards economics now, and I will stop in about 2 minutes, is not the failure of capitalism as such, about which one might say, as Gandhi is alleged to have said about Western civilization, that it would be a good idea, but the peculiar nature of modern banking, in particular the incestuous relationship between the banks, the central banks, by whatever name called, and governments, about which Rothbard and the other Austrian economists have written extensively. That peculiar relationship is at the root of the current crisis. Writing in Barron's magazine in March 2009, Randall Forsythe noted wryly, quote, "Will capitalism survive was the question before the lunch table on Wednesday. It hasn't been tried," I replied, "at least not since the McKinley administration, and certainly not since 1914, when the Federal Reserve started operations in earnest." Now, there's much more I could say on this. Moving on. Oh, I can't resist this. This is fun. Okay. Noam Chomsky, whom I'm sure you all know, is at MIT, well-known anarchist of another variety, allegedly. In an interview published in 2002, he said, quote, "The American version of libertarianism is an aberration. Nobody really takes it seriously," unquote. It's difficult to know how Chomsky would in fact substantiate this claim, and I suspect, perhaps cynically, that by nobody he means nobody he knows on the north bank of the Charles River between MIT and Harvard. He continues, "I mean, everybody knows that a society that worked by American libertarian principles would self-destruct in 3 seconds. It couldn't function for a second." There's a bit of a contradiction there, but hey. "And if it could, all you'd want to do is to get out or commit suicide or something." Once again, it's difficult to know what the evidence for such an extraordinary claim is. As a matter of fact, we don't all know about the necessary ephemeral life cycle of a libertarian society. On the contrary, such societies could and did function not just for 3 seconds, but for millennia. Ask yourself again, a little bit of historical imagination. Human beings have been in existence in their current form for God only knows how long. Okay? Let's say, evidence of language, 35,000 years. Before that, who knows how long it is, right? If you were to draw the usual sort of 24-hour graph of the political systems under which people have lived, and you started at time 0 and you moved on, okay, it's 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3, 6 in the morning, 9, 12, okay, you would not come to anything like the state until about 1156. Human beings somehow have managed, miraculously perhaps, to survive and flourish for most of their existence. I mean most of their existence without the state, despite what Chomsky might have you believe. All right. Well, okay. There is a lot more that I could say, but as I said, I don't want to punish you, and I really would love you to come back to me and ask me questions, not hard ones because it's Friday and I'm tired. Okay, but ask me any questions you like, and we'll have a conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, since we're videotaping the seminar, I'd like everyone to use the microphones to ask your questions, and please present yourselves and pass the mic around.
Yes, hello, my name is Thor. I've been studying here at the Cepos University. And I would like to ask about Rothbard's views of parenting, because
Yes.
I've read Locke's second treatise on civil government, and I was wondering how it differs, or if it differs from Locke's views. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. The answer is radically. Okay. Locke isn't a libertarian. Okay. And Rothbard is. So there lies the root of the distinction. Rothbard has, I told you that the chapter on children in the Ethics of Liberty is fairly radical and causes people to fall down and have fits and have to be carried out. So Locke's view on Rothbard's view on children is as follows. You have no right to control another human being fully developed. Okay, I have no right to dispose of you, your body, your person, or anything like that. What happens with children? Well, he thinks that children, parents, if you like, have a how should we describe it? They are the possessors of their children, but in what I would call an authoritative sense, in other words, for the child's own good, right? And the child, as soon as the child can emancipate itself, which it does, not by signing a form, but by actually getting up and going, right? Then it is free to do that. Okay? Now, this has radical implications for adoption and child protection and a whole variety of things. I don't know how many of you here, I'm sure, are parents. Most of my children have threatened to leave home at one time or another. When they did this, I opened the door and said, have a good time. Send me a postcard when you get wherever you're going. And they wandered off. Okay, I wandered off after them. I didn't let them see it, right? And then they came back a half an hour later. Okay, that's fine. I mean, hey, call your bluff. But Rothbard thinks, okay, they once said to me, oh, okay, I said to them, you know, think about this. If you find it hard to put up with me, just think how hard it is for me to put up with you, right? Okay, it works both ways. So Rothbard thinks, for example, that nobody can incur an obligation unless they explicitly agree to that, okay, as a result of a contract. So if you have a child, Rothbard thinks you actually have no obligation to support that child. You may not kill the child, but you have no obligation to support it. And therefore, you can dispose of it. You can, as it were, put a sign on the child saying, baby available, help yourself. Right? Now, this is radical, and it sounds fairly awful, but if you think about it, something like this has been in operation, sometimes in more organized forms than others, throughout the ages. At certain time, for example, if a woman had a child she couldn't or didn't want to support, or for whatever reason, it might be social or economic or financial, she would wrap the baby up, leave it on the doorstep of the local church, ring the bell, run away. And Rothbard says, that's all I'm talking about. You just make it available for quote-unquote homesteading by somebody else. In other words, some other person can come along and assume the right, as it were, to provide for the child and look after its welfare. Again, until such time as the child either is emancipated by naturally, or until that person, if you like, decides that they no longer wish to do it. Yes?
But in my understanding, that doesn't actually differ that much from Locke's view. Locke says that the child becomes independent at a certain age, and that certain age is the same age as when its parents became independent. But Locke also says that the right to, how should you say, control a child is linked to you taking care of it. So if you don't take care of it, you lose the right to control the child. So I think there are many similarities, actually,
okay,
except that Rothbard, emphasizes the freedom of the parents, whilst
he does.
Locke emphasizes the parents' rights to control the child.
No, you're correct. In fact, Rothbard thinks, if you like, that the rights of the parent are proportionate to their willingness to take on the responsibility to care for the child, right? If they're not entitled to abuse the child or to neglect the child. If they no longer wish to assume that responsibility, they must, if you like, pass it over to somebody else, and they can do that. And one of the things I'm working on in my current book is, as I said, distinguishing between power or force on the one hand and authority on the other hand. I think parents have a natural authority over their children. Conservative. What does that mean? Authority, however, is the use of force or violence if necessary. I mean, for example, when my children were 2, I did not allow them to cross the road by themselves. Okay? They often kicked and fussed and tried to pull away from my hand. Did I say as a libertarian I must let go? You must be joking. There is no way. I said, come back, you little brat, okay, and grab them and wouldn't, and so on, right? Now, my youngest son is 23, okay? He would probably soon will be holding me by the hand as I cross the road, okay? Such the nature of things. But the point about it is that authority, as distinct from power, is exercised by the one who has it for the good of those over whom it is exercised, rightly or wrongly. Now, of course, you can make mistakes, and so you can veer into authoritarianism, okay, or you can go towards neglect. So we all know most parents are normal and make the sort of normal mistakes that parents make. Some want their children to remain children for too long, and they don't allow them, you know, freedom, progressive freedom as you go on. Well, you see, most parents don't operate on the strict legal thing that when you're 18, you know, you're free to go. I mean, my number 3 son said to me, I can remember the day when you gave me permission to go into the city by myself. He was 12. Now, I made that decision for him. I did not make the same decision for the other children at the same age. It depended on their relative maturity. It was completely dependent upon who it was I was dealing with. It wasn't that we can all go in at this age. It was when I judged that they were sufficiently responsible to travel on the train and do what they did and come back and so on and so forth. Parents make those decisions. That's the exercise of authority. And Rothbard, if you like, is consistent in that. I think there are problems with his account, and this is one of the most challenging chapters, chapter 16, by the way, for anybody who wants to read it in the Ethics of Liberty, is one of the most challenging chapters, but I think it's capable of being interpreted in a way that is consistent with, if you like, my own particular views. I hope, anyway. Otherwise, I'm going to have a fight with Rothbard, which I will win because he's dead.
Jan Madsen, could you list some of Rothbard's original contributions to specific areas such as economics or history or philosophy?
Okay, I'm going to take a pass on the economics. I'm not sufficiently good at economics to judge in this particular matter. Okay, I leave that to others to develop. I actually prepared a bibliography, very carefully, 4-page, which I was to bring, and of course, needless to say, left it behind. Okay, so, but in, so you asked economics. What was your next one?
For example, history.
History, okay. All right. Rothbard, unlike many people in this area, is actually an historian. So he has written a 4-volume history of the American colonial period called Conceived of Liberty, when the whole of that period, if you like, is interpreted through a libertarian lens. This is unique. I don't know anybody who's done this. And it's massive. You're looking at something that comes close to another 1,600 pages when you put all 400 volumes. He has a 2-volume history of economics, if you like, from the earliest times, and he died before he finished the second one, but both have been brought out by the Mises Institute. Again, another 900 to 1,000 pages, okay, which I've read, and it's gripping stuff. It's wildly controversial in many ways. I mean, he attacks Adam Smith. And I mean, you know, he accuses him of all sorts of malfeasance, okay, not least of which being a tax collector, all right? But so and I deal with this in the book. He has a, if you like, so one great thing about him, by the way, is an historian. He's incredibly readable, right? I mean, you can't put the book down, right or wrong, exaggerated or overstated or understated, or whatever it might be. At least it's stimulating. So that's on the history front. So he's done that. So that was economics history. What was the next? Whatever I think. Yeah. What really Rothbard done? I mean, this would take too long. I mean, Rothbard is Mr. Libertarian in a sense. I mentioned that he began by, if you like, coming in at the end of the period of the American old right, who are sort of isolationists and anti-New Dealers. Okay, so he took all of that. Okay, he put that together with some strands which had been developed by 3 remarkable women: Isabel Patterson, part of Ayn Rand, and no, I can't think of the third, with Austrian economics, okay, and about 3 or 4 other things, and welded them into what is recognizably, if you like, a distinct political position. Now, you could say each of the elements came from somewhere else, and they did, right? But it takes a kind of certain skill to take some of these elements, which don't necessarily fit together all that well, and blend them, if you like, into a sort of particular view. He's not the only libertarian, and there are others. I mean, you know, you would have for example, you would have, say, on the very conservative end of this kind of libertarianism, you'd have somebody like Hans Hermann Hoppe, okay, doing his stuff, and then on the left wing, okay, of this way of doing things, you'd have people like Roderick Long, who's at Auburn University. And then somebody who sees himself as the sort of lineal successor to Rothbard would be somebody like Walter Block. Okay, and if you ever want to slap in the face when you're reading something more or less like what Rothbard would give you, you can read Walter Block. Right? Walter Block thinks his notion of property is so strong that if somebody drops in the building and catches onto your flagpole extending outside your property, you have not only no obligation to rescue them, you may actually ask them to leave without opening your window and allowing them in. Now that's pretty strong stuff. Okay. I think there are ways of reconciling that with something a little bit more reasonable, but that's Block for you. Okay, so challenging is the word.
My name is A. I'm a student at the Sebers University this spring. I would like you to elaborate on Rothbard's view on private court systems.
Oh, yes.
Please.
Okay. All right. As I said, the biggest objection to the whole libertarian thing, especially the anarchist one. Okay, sorry, let me frame this. In the libertarian camp, you can basically do it 2 ways. You can be a minimal government libertarian, and you can say everything is to be supplied on the free market except law, order, and security. Now, that's a much easier sell. Right? Because people say, oh, well, I can see how water could be supplied or food or whatever it might be. But yes, so we'll stop at so yeah. The anarchists, right, go all the way and say, you've got to be consistent on this one, right? And say everything can be supplied on this market. Now, what I tried to do in the book, and I'll talk about this a little bit more if you're foolish enough to turn up tomorrow, okay, and get a little bit more of this, is to say how, on a sort of Rothbardian principles, this is to be supplied. Try not to give away the whole paper and so on. Let me see if I can give a short answer. To come back to your point about Locke, Locke talks about the inconveniences of nature. And one of the inconveniences of the state of nature, according to Locke, is that we would have a situation where every man would be a judge in his own cause. Right? But of course, that doesn't follow. First of all, when you ask yourself, what are the contexts in which law originates? And it has to do largely with disputes. If you're getting on with persons and you don't have any problem, then law is irrelevant. In fact, if you ask yourself, in almost everything you do, at almost every time, every day of your life, how much does an awareness of what is or isn't legal, if you like, how much of that is actually present to you as a constraining or operating force? And the answer is probably not at all. Right? When you keep your appointments with people and when you make arrangements and you keep your promises and you give them back the books you've borrowed, again, are you think if I don't do this, I'm going to find myself with a legal sanction? The answer is no. Most of the things that most people do, most of the time they do simply because this is what we want to do. We want to get on with people. Come back to Aristotle. Man, he says, is not a political animal. That's a mistranslation. He says man is a creature of the polis. It's a different story. The polis being that community in which all goods can be, all the necessary goods for life can be supplied. Okay, but sometimes we have disputes and we need to resolve them. Well, again, dispute resolution can be simply had by people discussing things and sorting things out. So very often that's what we do. We make an arrangement. Sometimes we're not very happy, but we get on with it and so on. That's why marriage continues to exist, right? Okay, my wife says she's right and I agree, and that's everything's sorted. But sometimes you have a dispute and you cannot resolve it. Now, here you have a number of options. You can resort to violence, but violence is expensive. Okay, and you may come off the worst. You can lose, right? Besides which, the other person can always get you when you're asleep. Okay, it's problematic. Okay, and every culture, I mean, there are lots of historical examples, but every culture put a premium on not only dispute resolution, but dispute avoidance, if at all possible. So what happens is that in most traditional cultures, what happens is you have something like a moot, an assembly that comes together, and when things are really problematic, you bring the problem to the moot, and they'll say, has this ever happened before? And if the answer is yes, and your case matches the other one, more or less all the salient particulars, then they make a decision in that regard, and off you go, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens if you don't accept the decision? The answer is, well, you're back to where you started. You have to either agree or you have to go back to violence, and then you have the problem all over again. Now, let's take a modern example. Most of the traditional examples operate because of very extensive and tight kinship systems, and we don't have those today. They don't operate in the same way. Largely as a result, by the way, of if you believe something like Robert Nisbet, as the result of the rise of the post-Westphalian state. We'll leave that to one side. You can do it in a number of ways. So one thing you would do is you would contract with a defense agency. So a defense agency would provide me with defensive services, in other words, protect my home against theft and so on and so forth, right? So now what happens then, suppose that somebody commits a crime against my property, right? And I report this to the defense agency. They've set up cameras, they identify the culprit, okay? And the culprit is actually a member of the same protection agency. Well, we don't have a problem. Problem sorted. Okay, I get my property back, the person gets punished either by paying double or 1.5 times or whatever it is. Suppose, however, and this is a Nozickian problem, this is the problem that Robert Nozick says inevitably led him in the direction of the minimal state. Suppose, however, we have different protection agencies. What's going to happen there? Now, this is where Ayn Rand stops. She says, oh, well, all that's going to happen is you've displaced your problem from an interpersonal conflict to an interinstitutional conflict, and now the two defense agencies are going to attack each other. The answer is, no, they're not. Okay? First of all, because, let me give you an example. Right now, if you drive a car, you have insurance to protect you against catastrophic damage. And if there's a collision between you and another driver and you belong to different different insurance agencies, what happens? Do they suddenly come out and start hitting each other with sticks? And the answer is no. They have ways of dealing with this, right? They sort it out among themselves. They have loss and claim adjusters, and they sort it all out. They know this is going to happen, so they have set up arrangements for doing this in the first place, right? So what you would do normally in that situation is if you couldn't agree on it again yourselves, you can't have agreement, you refer it to a third party. Now, the Lockean problem is when Locke talks about the inconvenience, he makes the following category mistake. Locke thinks that since dispute resolution requires a third party, that there must always be the third party must always be the same third party. But of course that doesn't follow, right? If we two speakers here, right? If you two have a disagreement, you can refer it to me, right? But if you and I have a disagreement, we can refer it to you. You and I have a disagreement, we can refer it to you. What's the problem? It requires a third party, but not necessarily the same third party. And so the argument that we need a state which is independent and above and somehow beyond all of these, a sort of a permanent third party capable of doing this, is a mistake. Needless to say, and leave that to one side, by the way, the state courts, of course, are in the hands of the state. They enforce what the state wants. Even if you have a constitution as we do, invariably the constitutional interpretation, there's a presumption of constitutionality of acts, for example, so that if an act is passed, it's presumed to be constitutional unless it can be demonstrated that it's not, and that very rarely happens, right? But leave that to, then there are practical problems. Right now, if you have a big company and you make a contract with another big company, one of the things you will normally do is you will build into it a procedure by which, if a dispute arises, it will be settled by an independent arbitrator who is named in the contract. There's a reason for that. One, companies cannot afford to be tied up in the law courts for 10 or 15 years, not knowing what's going to happen. It's more important that a decision is made and made quickly than it's made with absolute accuracy. And so that's what they do. They sign up to this, and if they have a problem, then it's brought to the arbitrator. The arbitrator makes a decision, and because the companies have agreed to abide by it, they do. What happens if they don't? Well, then it will go into the legal system, and you have all sorts of problems. But more importantly, nobody else will make that kind of contract with a company which has defaulted. Why would you want to do that when they have demonstrated their unwillingness to abide by their agreements? This is the standard sort of way in which these things are done. Come back. I mean, this originated the whole of merchant law across Europe. Okay, all the way. I mean, France and Germany and the Hanseatic League up and down the Baltic and so on. You had a system of merchant law which was set up not by any particular jurisdiction, but simply by the merchants themselves. So I'm in Lisbon and I'm a wine seller. And somebody from Copenhagen once sends me a letter and says, send me a shipload of your best wine. Okay? And I go, sure. I mean, the guy doesn't pay. I've done a shipload of wine. That's a lot of money. What do? Well, I go down to my local merchants association. And they have a little book, a little car catalogue, whatever, in the 17th century or the equivalent. And they look it up. And they say, oh, yeah. Mr. Jensen is, he's done business before. There was a dispute 3 years ago. It was amicably resolved. We think it's quite safe to deal. That's how you do it. It's no problem. You had what was known in England as pie powder courts. Pie powder courts came when merchants arrived at a fair. And they're called pie powders. Pieds poutres from the French means dusty feet. There were dusty feet courts because the whole thing had to be resolved in the duration of the market. And if you were a merchant, you had to abide by the decisions. So if there was a problem, it had to be sorted, decision given and accepted within a space of 2, 3, or 4 days. And that's worked. That's the model. So there are technical problems, but then let's put it this way: no system of law is perfect. The system of law we have is ridiculous. Frankly, I speak, by the way, as somebody who has not only 1 but 2 law degrees in my sins. Okay, my son is a barrister, but the legal system is crazy. Like the first sensible advice that almost any lawyer will give you when you go to him is stay out of the courts. Right? Not only does it take forever and cost a small fortune, you have no idea what insanity you're going to get by way of a ruling from a judge who has nothing to lose by it. An arbitrator, by the way, a private arbitrator can stay in business only as long as the judgments, A, are informed and scrupulously unbiased. The moment there's any suspicion of incompetence or bias, your arbitrator goes out of business. The market takes care of it. The judges stay on the bench even when they're senile.
Is it okay with you to take a couple of questions at a time?
Of course. I'm capable of not answering all of them at the same time.
My name is Adam Stoltenberg. I'm a Danish high school student. My question is, I see it right now, the modern libertarian movement, that Murray Rothbard has a kind of religious reverence, that people follow his word like the Bible.
Yeah.
And I think that there have been several devastating attacks on his work, coming mainly from, in my point of view, Samuel Edward Konkin. But I also would like to point out that Murray Rothbard even admitted that argumentation ethics was completely superior to his treatise on natural law. So I think that his cult of personality sort of excludes a lot of great libertarian thinkers, and I think that institutes like the Ludwig von Mises Institute, etc., only perpetrates this problem.
Okay. That was an easy question.
We're making it difficult by having very long questions.
Thank you for that.
Thanks. My name is Bruce. I'm one of those Lower East Side Jews.
Fantastic.
A real one.
A real one.
Who for 5 decades has been trying to throw off the shackles of leftist orthodoxy. And first of all, I would like to thank you very much for presenting a very good overview in a short period of time. It was wonderful, really. I have a point of, clarification for you. When you talked about the laws relating to libel and slander, in the United States, there's a different standard.
Yep.
You probably know.
Yep.
That truth
is
an
defense.
absolute defense against libel and slander. And if you're a public official or if you're someone who's prominent, even if persons say things that are not true, you cannot sue them for libel or for slander. So it's a very, very liberal interpretation. One of the few enlightened laws.
That's why I like the United States. I lived there for 8 years. It's a wonderful place.
And I have a question for you.
Yes.
Just how would a libertarian handle a situation where there's a private high school, okay, and the owner of the private high school photographs students in the locker room and then takes those photos, uploads them on the internet, charges for it. What exactly has that person done wrong or against the tenets of libertarianism, and how would that be handled?
Okay, it's another easy question.
Just to top it off, I have just one very small question.
This is going to be the coup de grace.
I would like if you could at the end maybe say a bit about how do we actually get there?
Yes. Oh, okay.
Yeah, just that small bit.
That's the easy one. Okay. Okay, first things first. No, you're right. The cult of anybody, right, in other words, the movement of anybody into a position where they are seemingly faultless and so on. Murray Rothbard was not faultless. He was not faultless in his personality, right? And no doubt much of what he does will be revised, extended, or destroyed. I have no problem with that. Okay? So I'm not a cultist of any kind. Okay, whether it's of Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard or Aristotle or Aquinas or anybody like that. In medieval philosophy, I often say to my students, the philosophical world did not come to a crashing halt in 1274, and neither did the libertarian movement come to a crashing halt in 1296. There is a lively debate, if you like, among the whole libertarian movement, sort of left and right on the web and others, and so I mean, yes, by all means, I would say to people, go read all of that stuff and make up your own mind and so on, and don't. If what you're urging against me is the dangers, if you like, of some kind of intellectual idolatry, I could only say I heartily agree with you. I don't disagree with you at all. Right. The only reason, there are two reasons why I wrote this book. One, because they pay me a lot of money. No, they didn't. Okay. One, because I got a phone call from John Meadowcroft, who was the person doing it. We were in touch about something, and he said, did I know anybody who could write a book on this? To which I said, me. Okay, and so I did, because I thought he wasn't going to be included in this, and it was only if he couldn't find somebody, he wasn't going to be there. So that's why I did it, but not because I think he's God or anything near to it. Your question is more difficult, but the idea of somebody who has a private high school and takes photographs of somebody in a locker room and puts them on the web. Here, you'd have to flesh out the context. But clearly, I would suggest that in that context, there's probably been a violation of contract. Normally, in those circumstances, when you send your children to a school, for example, there's either an explicit or contract of some kind that it's going to be for particular purposes, and the kinds of things you're talking about there are not included on it. So my guess is that, but you need to fill it out. Okay, my guess is that you're going to get somebody for breach of contract. Okay, if nothing else.
Implicit.
Yeah, but I mean, it's even more so than that. It probably would be explicit. I mean, and so on, especially in today's environment. The third question is, how do we get there from here? And the answer is, as quickly as we can, right? Murray Rothbard was a button pusher. His view was that you're not a really red-blooded libertarian unless if you were presented with a button which would destroy the world as we now know, the social world, and take you straight into a libertarian world, you wouldn't push that button. And I have to say, well, yeah, but he backed off on that one a little bit. And the answer is this. Look, the political and social world we now live in has been constructed over at least 350, almost 400 years in a particular way. If you want to take that down, if you like, into a libertarian situation, and you want to do it by pressing a button, you're going to cause massive destruction. It seems to me crazy to suggest that you would simply want to do that. So the answer is, I suggest, is that you take it down, if you like, as you would a building in the center of town that was surrounded by other precious buildings. You would deconstruct from the top down. Now, here, by the way, the thing is, as quickly as you possibly can, with safety to all, right? So the first things that would go, and they're already going, because remember my example about the telephones? The sacrosanct nature of telephones? Now, nobody thinks this is something that the state has to provide, let alone that it's the best provider. So all of those kinds of services which the state has provided, even in my own locality, for example, the collection of refuse was a matter for the local council up to about 10 years ago. Now we have 4 companies competing. That was unthinkable. So all of those things, that's the upper layer, that comes down very quickly, and it's already in the process of going away. The next level would be a whole matter of regulations. One of the things I brought along today, just for fun, was a list of United States federal agencies. Okay? I started to laugh. Not only are they the ones explicitly operating under the various departments of government, but there are, just wait for it, I counted 84, okay, that are independent. And these have statutory powers, all right? the Administrative Conference of the United States, the African Development Foundation, the Commission on Civil Rights, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Election Commission, Federal Mediation and Conciliation. I'm only just going through them, right? They go on forever. These are the really nasty things, not just the overt power of the state, but all of these bodies, by the way, which are largely unaccountable and definitely unrepresentative, and which can order you about with impunity, right? Horrible stuff. But the point is, okay, so we need to get rid of all that. Then the three big ones, health, education, and welfare, right, need to be destroyed. In Ireland, health, education, and welfare account for over 50% of the budget. That is to say, the money taken from the taxpayers, right? Right now, we have a situation where the government is trying to claw back 1 billion from public service workers when they pay 3 billion out in child benefit to everyone, regardless of the circumstances of their children. My question is, why don't you just abolish it and replace it with something simpler and which is directed, targeted towards people? Doesn't that seem thing? And the answer is no, because people are now used to it. Okay, they're dependent. So we've created a dependency culture. There are masses of people. Again, my host gave me the figures. He said there's something like 4.2 million workers in Denmark. I'm not sure if these figures are correct. And something like, when you add up all the figures, something like 2.7 million people are somehow either directly or indirectly dependent on the state. That means an awful lot of people are on the receiving end and a very small number of people. And so we've gone from a pyramid like this to an inverted pyramid. And I tell you something, people at the bottom of this are going to get sick of this very soon. All right? But anyway, so you need to get rid of health, education, and welfare. Education should go first, okay, which means no money for the universities. I say this, okay? I'm in the university. No public money for the universities. Let them operate in the private market. And if they go down, they go down. And if they survive, they survive. No money for second level. Right? And finally, no money for the babysitting service we call primary education. Because that's primarily what it is. Okay, certainly in my country, nobody learns anything. It's just kind of play school for 6 or 7 years. It's an expensive way of providing child-minding services for the population. So get rid of all of that. Okay, then health. You want to require people, in other words, imagine, here's an example. Suppose you wanted to take out a policy on your car on which you could claim for everything that happened to your car. You got a little nick, you could take it and have it repaired. Your lights weren't working, and so on. You ran out of oil, you wanted an oil change, you could take it in. Imagine how much that policy would cost. The answer is a fortune. But in car insurance, if you like, insures us only against catastrophic damage by and large. In other words, if you cause so much damage or death that the cost would be something you simply couldn't pay, so you lay it off in an insurance policy. Well, health should be provided in the same way. In other words, everybody should sensibly take out, if you like, insurance against catastrophic disasters on health. Everything else you pay for. I live in a wonderful country, by the way, in which I pay for public health, and I also require private health insurance, and I still pay when I go to the hospital, and I still pay when I go to the doctor. How about that? That's a triple whammy. That makes me feel so good. I feel sick already, you know. Okay, I think I'll go to the doctor, except it would cost me money. So health has to go. Huge. It's a bottomless pit. You cannot provide enough. Okay, you can throw money in all you like. It'll take everything you've got and more. So that's got to go. Welfare is the next. Okay, welfare starts in the following way. People look around and, motivated by a sense of charity, look around and they see people who are in desperate poverty and need, and they say, look, let's give these people something. Okay, and all right, that's how it starts. But when it starts, the ratio, if you like, of dependence to those supplying it is something like 1 to 20. Right? For every one person who's receiving some benefit, and it was never that generous to start with, there are 20 people in employment. The cost is spread in that particular way. I'm not saying, by the way, in a libertarian it would be justified anyway, but I'm just making the point. Right? We've now got to a situation in which the 1 to 20 has moved, right? And eventually it's almost 1-on-1, and eventually it will invert. That is simply unsustainable. It cannot be done. Apart from the fact that it is wildly unjust, it's incredibly inefficient, and by the way, it is not only damaging to the people who have to pay the taxes, it's even more damaging to those who are institutionally infantilized. Here's what we say, just as the ancient Romans said to the mob in Rome, here, we'll give you bread so you don't go hungry, and we'll give you circus in the afternoon so you're not bored, just stay quiet, right? And don't cause any trouble, and make sure you vote for us in the elections. Right now, in Dublin, in West Dublin, there is a village which is expanded to so that there are now 80,000 people who live out there. And it's a wilderness. It's a social wilderness. It's a ghetto. And we have said to those people, you're useless. You're a waste of time. You're a waste of space. Okay? Here's some money. Okay? Feed yourselves. Put some money in the horses in the afternoon. Okay? And stay away from us. Health, education, and welfare have got to go. And then, when you've got rid of all of that, and health, education, welfare, then, and only then, is it time to come to the issue of law, justice, and security. That will be the last one to go.
I think we've actually spent a bit more time than what was put in the program, so I think we'll stop here. But thank you very much, Professor Casey, for a very interesting